there was a very powerful dominant ideology that was particularly championed by the Fed, which said that innovation was a very good thing, that slicing and dicing credit risk had made the financial system dramatically safer. And so the reason why we were living in such an extraordinarily benign credit period was not because we were enjoying a crazy credit bubble with massive amounts of leverage, which was basically creating an asset boom and huge distortions. The theory that was being pumped out was that actually innovation had parceled risk around the world in such a way that made the system safer and stronger and more efficient and rational, so there was no need to worry. I write in my book about how the BIS had big misgivings about this and tried to challenge the Fed on some occasions about this, and they tended to be shut up quite aggressively on occasion. In my own case, when I started writing columns and articles which challenged the dominant creed of that risk dispersion was a good thing, or automatically a good thing, I had, again, a very strong reaction from some of the bankers and from some of the policymakers. It wasn't easy to challenge the conventional wisdom. Now, there are two big caveats I have to mention straight away. Firstly, these are the health warnings. Firstly, I wouldn't pretend for a millisecond that JP Morgan bankers were the only people who invented these ideas. There were a number of people who also dreamt up concepts at different stages in recent decades, and I do actually try and point that out in the book. In fact, JP Morgan didn't invent credit default swaps. That honor goes, I gather, to some people at Bankers Trust. Secondly, by focusing on JP Morgan bankers, I am not intending to say that I blame JP Morgan bankers for the disasters that have unfolded. One of the terrible, bitter ironies of this entire story is that while some of the JP Morgan guys and women may have played a crucial role in unleashing the genie from the bottle in terms of innovation, they were not the ones who actually perverted those ideas with such disastrous consequences in subsequent years. On the contrary, they actually rather played it safe towards the end. Life is full of ironies, and this is a particularly spectacular irony. But I decided to tell the story of JP Morgan, and essentially the book is divided into three parts, which pretty much capture the unfolding of events as I see them. The first part is called Innovation, and that takes the story back to the late 1970s. And I think it's very important to start back then because it's been very easy in the hurly-burly of dramatic events that have overwhelmed us in the last 2 years to somehow assume that all of this was cooked up in the last 2 or 3 years, that it's all Greenspan's fault, etc., etc. And in fact, it's incredibly important to realize that what has occurred has really grown out of a set of developments in finance that have been underway for the best part of 3 decades. Now, in one respect, the starting point can go back to the late 1970s with the birth of the derivatives industry in the Western financial world. Derivatives of some form, as most of you will know, have been around in some ways for centuries. I mean, you can go back to the Babylonian times for quasi-derivative contracts. The Japanese had derivatives in the rice markets 2 or 3 centuries ago. The commodities exchanges in America created derivatives back in the 19th century. But in the 1970s, bankers started applying the idea of derivatives to interest rates, creating products called interest rate swaps, which essentially allow bankers to swap floating and fixed rates between different contracts without having to actually rewrite the contracts themselves. Bankers often refer to this as synthetic finance because, in a sense, you're creating almost out of thin air or in cyberspace a contract which doesn't actually change the underlying contract that has already been struck. So originally this was created in relation to interest rates, swaps, and then in the early 1990s, bankers started to look at applying this idea to credit risk, to the type of default risk that banks take on when they lend people money or when they underwrite bonds, to see whether the same ideas could be applied there. And in some ways, this was simply a natural extension of what had already been done in the interest rate world. In other ways, though, it wasn't, because default risk is pretty crucial to the idea of what being a bank is. I mean, basically, if you are a bank, as perceived in the old-fashioned way, you collect money and you lend it out. And if somebody goes bust, you suffer losses. Your job as a banker is to make sure they don't go bust, and your job as a banker is to make sure you always have enough reserves on hand, enough spare rainy day funds to protect yourself if people go bust, if your lenders go bust. But when you start entering a world where you can use derivatives to insure yourself against that risk, or to try and sell it to somebody else, then suddenly the business of banking changes. You can make loans, and suddenly you're not on the hook anymore. In which case the question becomes, well, is there a limit to how many loans you can make if actually you're not actually on the hook anymore? How do you measure the limits of that? And at what point do you really care about whether you've actually got the deposits in the bank to make those loans or not? The concept of being a bank starts to change. Now, this wasn't the first time that the concept of bank has started to change. Even before the advent of derivatives, bankers had started to play around with the idea of shifting some of their loan risk by selling it to other people, selling the loans in some form, or getting banks to club together to share the risk as a group. That's what syndicated finance basically is about. But derivatives essentially turbocharged that process. And the people who really turbocharged it most of all were a small group of bankers in New York, and then also London to a lesser extent initially, who were playing around with the idea of creating these so-called credit default swaps. Now, for the purposes of trying to write a story which is understandable by a wider range of people, the event I've chosen to focus on, which became subsequently a bit of a sort of benchmark for some of them, was a great offsite in the Florida resort of Boca Raton back in 1994, when a bunch of them got together, and in between getting pretty drunk and throwing each other in the pool and having fisticuffs, they started to have a debate, the ones who were sober enough to think about it, and started to have a debate about credit default swaps, and they decided, as a group, that they really wanted to go forward and explore that idea. In reality, it then took several months for the whole thing to play out. But by the mid to late 1990s, they'd stumbled, this JP Morgan team, on a way to not merely write credit default swaps, but to do so on a large scale, to bundle them together using a structure that came to be known as bistro. Technically, it was short for broad securitized index trust, broad index securitized trust offering or something like that. In reality, one of the team called it that because they wanted it to stand for BIS total ripoff. Because one of the things that I did was to play around with the Basel rules about how much capital the banks needed to hold to offset the risk of loans. Coming back to the idea that when you start transferring the risk of loans, the whole idea of how much capital you need to hold starts to look very grey relative to how many loans you can actually pump out at the same time. But they bundled these credit default swaps together, they created Bistro, and the idea began to take off like wildfire. Now, right from the beginning, the JP Morgan team who actually created this Bistro idea spotted that there were potential flaws. One of the challenges they had to deal with, which I won't go into right now because it is a bit technical, and you can read the book if you want to find out, but one of the challenges was about the degree to which they had to fund that original structure or not. And to cut a long story short, they got around that by basically only funding a very small part of the structure, leaving most of it unfunded. It kind of wafted around in a bit of a theoretical limbo land, and the regulators weren't quite sure how to treat it. And they gave it a name called Super Senior and then sold it to AIG, which with later subsequent disastrous consequences. But that was one of the problems they were grappling with. What do you do with super senior risk? In fact, in theory, the model suggested super senior risk was dead safe, and they could pile it up on their own balance sheet until the cows come home. And of course, subsequently, lots of banks did. The JP Morgan guys actually spotted that that may not be such a good idea quite early on, and they applied a bit of common sense, and they tried to get rid of it, largely to AIG and others. But that's sort of one interesting wrinkle about what happened. Another interesting wrinkle is that the JP Morgan guys started off playing around with their ideas in relation to corporate credit, primarily because that was their expertise. Subsequently, they tried once, and then again the second time a little bit, doing the same thing with mortgage debt. They didn't know as much about mortgage debt because JP Morgan wasn't a mortgage bank, first and foremost. They thought, hey, let's give it a go. They were at the final frontier of finance, let's keep exploring. And they very quickly decided actually that was a really bad idea because there just wasn't enough data out there about how mortgages would behave in a downturn to actually make the models work. So they did it once with great misgivings. They did it again, and then they dropped it, even though they could have actually earned some quite nice profits by going down that route. But they were a pretty conservative team in some ways, ironically, which says a lot about the JP Morgan culture. And they were pretty wary. So, fast forward a couple of years to the early part of this decade, and JP Morgan undergoes a moderately disastrous merger, as often happens in the banking world. And again, as often happens in the banking world, this little team break up and start scattering across the rest of Wall Street and the City of London. I sometimes visualize it a bit like a sort of alien space pod, where basically the pod breaks up and bing, all these people scatter. And these ideas scatter too. And as they scatter, they start to fuse and blend with other ideas floating around with finance. And one of the ideas that it starts to fuse and blend with in particular is the idea of slicing and dicing mortgage debt. Now, that stream of finance had been already developing for a couple of decades. Some of you in this room may be familiar with the work that was being done really in the late 1970s, early 1980s, in terms of creating collateralized mortgage obligations, bundling together mortgages, particularly in America, selling them to other investors or other banks, and trying to find ways to securitize them. Anyone who's read Liar's Poker will know about the kind of early trading of mortgage bonds that was being done by the gunslingers at Salomon Brothers a good 15, 20 years ago. But essentially what happened up until the early years of this decade, the mortgage slicing and dicing tribe had been a rather separate gang from the derivatives tribe. They just really didn't talk to each other. They were different kinds of people. And in the early years of this decade, the two tribes began to collide. Ideas cross-fertilized, and bankers hit on the wonderful idea of taking subprime mortgage debt, slicing and dicing it, using all these derivative techniques, and creating a whole brave new world of, if you like, son of bistro products. They called them CDOs, synthetic CDOs, all of that. And it took off like a rocket because suddenly it became very lucrative. Of course, Alan Greenspan was busy slashing rates left, right, and centre, and the regulators were de facto cheering the whole thing on. Now, the big bitter irony, as I mentioned before, is that as this whole wild mortgage innovation / CDO innovation party took off, sparking along the way a big subprime boom, because you could only create this stuff if you had the raw material to put into it, which meant that you had to go out and make lots of subprime mortgage loans. As it took off, as lots of other banks copied the original ideas, in fact, JP Morgan itself rather sat on the sidelines as far as the mortgage slicing and dicing of debt was concerned. That's partly because they were in chaos after their banking merger, their bad banking merger with Chase. So it was partly just sheer luck that kept them out. It was partly because, in fact, a few of the old JP Morgan team were still at the bank and tended to be rather conservative. And they were backed up in that stance by Jamie Dimon, the man who is now deemed to walk on water in the American financial world because he's one of the few great survivors. But he's a man who has fairly natural conservative bent as well. But that natural conservatism, although it was at foot at JP Morgan, at least in terms of mortgage slicing and dicing, doesn't mean they didn't do plenty of other stupid things, but on that point they were quite conservative, wasn't at work at other banks. And so other banks basically picked up these schemes and went completely mad. They started piling up super senior debt on their books with gay abandon, having, in some senses, conversations that were uncannily similar to what JP Morgan had discussed back in 1998 and 1999, but basically went in entirely the opposite direction. And they started slicing and dicing mortgage debt. Now, the only thing that, in retrospect, is more remarkable than the degree to which that happened is the fact that actually most people had very little idea that it was going on that scale, which comes back to my original point about the fact that when I was bouncing around in 2005 and 2006 trying to piece it together, I was continually shocked by the lack of holistic thinking and just how little the banks seemed to know about what other banks were up to. And the point that brought this home to me most powerfully of all was that when it finally became clear after the credit bubble burst in 2007 just how stupid some of the other banks had been, it also became clear that for the most part the senior managers of the other banks hadn't known what their own traders had been up to or hadn't understood the implications at all. But also, even at JP Morgan, they hadn't quite realized the degree to which other banks were engaging in these games. In fact, ironically enough, some of the people who had actually created the bistro structures in the first place insisted repeatedly to me, and, hey, they might have been lying through their teeth, but, I don't think so, that they hadn't realized the degree to which the bistro ideas were being used and abused all over the place to that scale. And these days, if you talk to them, they are, as I describe in my book, they have a very mixed bag of emotions about it. I mean, some of them sit there and think, well, it wasn't really our job to stop other banks being so darn stupid. Where on earth were the regulators? Well, it's a fair question, except that for many years the banking industry did try to keep the regulators off their back as much as possible. So it's a bit hard to ask where the regulators were as a banker if for all those years you wanted the regulators out of the room as much as possible. Some of them today say, well, maybe we should have known, maybe we should have done more to try and warn about this. One or two of them did spot it. One character in my book in particular had a very good idea about what was going on and effectively traded against it. He basically made hay off the back of the bank's stupidity. Could he or should he have blown the whistle? Well, he tried to, but no one wanted to listen. It comes back to my point, is that people just didn't want to hear this kind of stuff all those years ago. And, his line is, well, listen, I would do everything I can to make the world a better place, but until that moment, I'm going to try and make money for my investors. He runs a hedge fund, as you might guess. But it's an extraordinary story, which basically, when I stand here as an anthropologist, allowing for my training, which tends to make me quite relativist, rather than making, shrill moral judgments, I tend to try and, understand what happened and leave it up to the readers to decide what they think was good or bad about this. But in terms of, the question of, what the lessons are and where we go from here, I'm currently not in the camp who would say, well, I think that, all innovation is bad, banks should be stopped from using, complex products. The parallel I would often use is that, just because people have misread the label on a bottle of prescription drugs and maybe have got sick, or just because one or two people have gone wrong, doesn't mean you necessarily should ban all prescription drugs overnight. So I wouldn't throw innovation out today, but it clearly has been abused on a chronic, terrifying scale. And we as a society need to rethink how we handle financial innovation, much as we need to look at how we handle, say, medical innovation, biological innovation in many other spheres of life. There clearly needs to be massive reform in the way that many banks are structured. The fact that so many banks did not understand what their own, or the senior management of so many banks did not understand what their own traders were up to, points to chronic corporate governance failures.
I'm an alumni of both the LSE and Bankers Trust, and I've taken a great interest in all of what's gone on, and I still work in the city. My question really is, how much of this could have gone on if the central bankers hadn't also at the same time been letting liquidity go at quite such a frenetic pace? I mean, it strikes me that if there's one thing that at the root of the credit crisis, it's the fact there's too much credit around. And this is undoubtedly a very bad symptom, but it's a symptom, not the cause.
Mm-hmm. I would broadly agree with that. The reason I chose to talk about the symptom, not just the cause, is because actually the cause has been quite widely discussed. The symptom less so, and the symptom still important. Another way to explain it is basically, I'm explaining the channels through which this excess liquidity was dispersed. The one caveat I would make, though, is this, that precisely because the innovation became so frenetic, there was not merely a pull factor in terms of lots of cheap liquidity coming through the system, there was also, if you like, a push factor in that people were slicing and dicing loans so fast that they were creating the illusion of there being even more credit than there actually was, in a sense. The classic example of this is that, from 2005 onwards, in Europe, technically the ECB and co were trying to raise rates and bump up the cost of borrowing. The cost for leveraged companies of actually borrowing was going down because bankers were so busy creating CLOs that there was frenetic demand for loans, which kept the price of loans going up, and so the cost of borrowing going down. And so it actually, if you like, exacerbated the problem. And the other thing I'd say is precisely because this innovation was so complex and so poorly understood, the degree to which leverage was building up in the system as a result of this excess liquidity was very poorly understood. It was basically concealed. I mean, the BIS kept saying, we think there's far too much leverage out there. We really must try and measure it. The Fed, which tended to look at measures of leverage that were based on things like LTCM, would say, well, no, if you look at the metrics that we used around the time of LTCM, it really ain't too bad. But people couldn't see just how bad things were getting because of the complexity of the channel through which it was being dispersed.
Do you think it's fitting that the man who oversaw the establishment of the tripartite governance system in the UK, who presided over the ascent of the city, who turned a blind eye and allowed light touch regulation, is now a member of the Morgan Mafia? Who might be still wondering it's Tony Blair.
I go back to my anthropological image of a village. Elites tend to club together.